The letter hit the table like a verdict. Maggie Hawthorne read it 3 times, and each time the words rearranged themselves into the same ugly truth. The Finley Ranch in Colby Creek, Texas, was hemorrhaging money, had been for 2 years. The cattle were down to a third of what they'd been. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The foreman had quit, 2 hands had followed him out, and the man who ran the place, one Elias Finley, had reportedly not been seen in town since winter. The woman who'd written the letter was named Dorothea Crane, and she ran the boarding house where Maggie's cousin had stayed during a brief time in Colby Creek the previous autumn. Dorothea had meant it as kindness. She'd heard through a chain of whispers that Maggie Hawthorne of Abilene, Kansas, had answered an advertisement placed by said Elias Finley, seeking a practical woman willing to relocate to the Texas Panhandle for purposes of matrimony and partnership. Dorothea had meant to save her. That was the betrayal hiding inside the kindness, the assumption that Maggie needed saving from her own choices. Maggie folded the letter, pressed it flat with her palm, and then tucked it into the inside pocket of her traveling coat. She boarded the train anyway. That decision, the one that seemed impulsive to everyone who knew her, was in fact the most calculated thing Maggie Hawthorne had ever done. She'd been told the ranch was failing. She'd been told the man was possibly broken. She'd been handed every reason to turn around and go back to the cramped boarding house room in Abilene, where she'd spent the past 2 years sewing buttonholes for a dress shop that paid her barely enough to eat. She arrived at the Colby Creek station on a Wednesday afternoon in April of 1882 with 2 leather trunks, a hat box, and a set of jaw muscles so tight they could have cracked a walnut. She did not expect what she found. Not the ranch, which was indeed in a state that made her stomach drop when she first saw it from the wagon road, the fence posts leaning like drunks, the barn roof sagging on one side, the bunkhouse windows dark at 4 in the afternoon. Not the land, which was so flat and enormous it felt like the sky was trying to swallow it whole. And not Elias Finley. She had expected someone beaten, someone apologetic, someone who looked the way a man looked when he'd lost. Instead, Elias Finley was standing on the top rail of a fence that was absolutely not strong enough to support him, staring out at the southern pasture, completely unaware that the wagon carrying her was rolling up his drive. He was 6 feet of dark-coated tension, wind-burned and lean, with his hat pushed back on his head, and his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that was either defiance or grief. She couldn't tell which. She would spend the next several months learning that with him it was usually both. He heard the wagon before he saw it, and he came down off that fence rail in one smooth motion that told her his body, at least, still worked the way it was supposed to. He turned toward her, and for 1/2 second, just one, she saw his face stripped down to something raw and startled before he put the wall back up. "You came," he said, not a greeting, not a question. Just those 2 words, delivered flatly like a man reading from a document he hadn't expected to arrive. "I came," Maggie said. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for the driver to assist her. She straightened her coat, looked directly at him across the dusty yard, and said the thing that would define every single day that followed. "I was told it was failing," she said. "I'm calling it a starting point." Elias Finley stared at her for a long moment. A muscle moved in his jaw. His eyes, which were a complicated shade between green and gray that she wouldn't be able to name until she'd seen them in every kind of light, gave nothing away. "You know what you walked into," he said finally. "I know what I walked into," she agreed. He looked at her trunks, he looked at her hat box, he looked at her face, which she kept absolutely still. "I've got nothing to offer you," he said, and there was something underneath the words, something that was not pride or arrogance, but something more like a dark past pressing up against the underside of his sentences. "Good," Maggie said. "Then we'll build from scratch. That's the only way I know how." She walked past him toward the house before he could answer, which was a thing she'd calculated just as carefully as her decision to board the train. The Finley Ranch had been christened the Cedar Cross in 1869 by Elias' father, Nathaniel Finley, who'd come out of Missouri after the war with nothing but a land claim, a mule, and a set of hands that hadn't forgotten how to work even when everything else about him had come undone. Nathaniel had spent 12 years building Cedar Cross into something real, something that produced beef cattle and hired men and paid its debts. He'd done it alongside his wife, Clara, who died of fever when Elias was 17, and whose absence had changed the composition of everything in the house in ways that no one had ever quite recovered from. Nathaniel had died in the autumn of 1880, 18 months before Maggie arrived, leaving Cedar Cross to Elias, who was 28 years old and had been running the operation beside his father for a decade. What looked like inheritance was in fact a trap. Nathaniel had borrowed against the land twice in his final years to cover a drought year, and then a cattle disease that had swept through the southern herds. The loans were held by a man named Vernon Chastain, who owned the bank in Colby Creek and several other things in Colby Creek besides, and who had been waiting with what Maggie would later come to call the patience of a predator for the exact right moment to move. Elias had known about the loans. What he hadn't known, and what constituted the secret that burned inside him like a coal he couldn't put out, was that his father had signed an acceleration clause into both of them, meaning that if the ranch missed 3 consecutive payments, Chastain had the right to call the entire balance due at once. 3 consecutive payments, which was precisely what had happened, and precisely what Chastain had begun moving on the week before Maggie Hawthorne stepped off the train. She didn't know any of this the first night. The house was quieter than she'd expected, and smaller, but the bones of it were good solid timber frame, real glass in the windows, a fireplace in the main room that drew properly. Elias had made up the second bedroom for her with a clean quilt and a pitcher of water, which told her that whatever else he was not without care. He'd prepared this space for someone. He'd expected her, even if her actual arrival had startled something alive in him that he hadn't planned for. They ate supper in near silence, a meal he'd made himself, which was beans and salt pork and corn bread, and which she ate entirely without complaint because she'd grown up on worse. "The 2 hands I have left are named Petey and Cord," he said finally, after the silence had stretched long enough that it required addressing. "Petey's been here 12 years. He's reliable. Cord came on in the fall, and I can't vouch for him the way I'd like to." "Why can't you vouch for him?" Maggie asked. He looked up from his plate. She could see him measuring something, deciding how much to disclose. "He has connections to Chastain," Elias said. "I don't know what kind." Maggie absorbed this. "You think he's reporting back?" "I think it's possible. Then why keep him? Because I'm down to 2 hands and I can't afford to run this place alone." That was honest. She appreciated it. She pressed the tip of her fork against the edge of her plate and said, "What do you need most right now?" The question visibly surprised him. She suspected he'd been expecting either panic or reproach, and she'd given him neither. "The fence in the south pasture is the immediate problem," he said. "Cattle are getting through onto Hendrix's land, and Hendrix is not a patient man. If I don't get those posts set in the next week, he'll have grounds to push for damages, and I cannot absorb damages right now." "Then we start with the fence," Maggie said. She said it the way you'd say it about any ordinary project on any ordinary day, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, something that was not yet trust, but was perhaps the first small crack through which trust might eventually enter. She was awake before dawn. She'd pulled on her heaviest dress, her work boots, and her coat, and she was standing in the yard looking at the fence line with a critical eye when Elias came out and found her there. He stopped on the porch steps for a moment, taking in the sight of her in the gray pre-sunrise light, and said nothing for a moment that went 3 seconds longer than necessary. "You don't have to do the fence work yourself," he said. "I know," she said, "but I can hold posts while they're set, and that frees up a second person to do other things. Where are the extra posts?" He pointed. She walked toward the barn. Petey, it turned out, was a man of about 50 with a silver mustache and a way of looking at the world that suggested he'd seen most of what it had to offer and had made his peace with the majority of it. He accepted Maggie's presence on the fence line with the minimum possible commentary and the maximum possible competence, and she liked him immediately and unreservedly. Cord was another matter. He was younger, perhaps 25, with sharp eyes that moved too quickly and a mouth that smiled more than it needed to. He was not overtly hostile. He was the kind of man who was never overtly anything, which Maggie found significantly more concerning than open opposition. They worked the south fence for 3 days. The physical labor was hard in a way that Maggie's body protested the first night, and then, having made its objections clearly, simply adapted to. She drove posts. She held wire. She walked the full length of the damaged section with Elias on the second morning, and he explained the land to her in the plain, precise way he seemed to explain everything, without romance or ornamentation, just facts laid out like tools. The cattle, he told her, were Herefords, a breed her father had spoken highly of in the abstract but which she was now seeing in their solid, practical reality. There were 47 left, down from over 140 when his father had been at peak operation. The plan had been to rebuild the herd gradually through sales of the current stock and strategic purchases of new breeding animals. That plan required capital. Capital required time. Time required Chastain to hold his patience. Chastain, Maggie would learn, had run out of patience in February. She learned this from Petey, who told her on the third afternoon while they were working the fence line, and Elias had ridden back to check the water tank. Petey told her the way a person tells something that they believe the other person needs to know because they are invested in the outcome. He told her about the acceleration clause, about the meeting Elias had had with Chastain at the bank in January, about the ultimatum that had apparently been delivered in terms that were legally binding and personally contemptuous, and about the fact that Elias had approximately 60 days left before Chastain's lawyer would file. Maggie pressed her gloved hands against the wire she was holding and looked out at the flat Texas horizon. "How much is the total balance?" she asked. Petey told her. The number was not impossible. It was not a small number, but it was a number that existed in a category that she could potentially work with if she thought carefully and moved quickly. "Who owns the land north of the Hendricks property?" she asked. Petey looked at her sideways. "Old Becker Place. It's been empty 3 years. Why?" "Just mapping things out," she said. That night she sat at the kitchen table after supper with a piece of paper and a pencil and worked through everything she knew. The cattle count. The current market price for beef in Abilene and in Fort Worth. What a full sale of the current herd would net. What a partial sale would net, and what it would leave for operating the following season. The cost of 2 additional hands. The gap between what Cedar Cross could produce and what it owed. She was still working when Elias came back downstairs, having apparently been unable to sleep. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the lamp still lit, and then he saw the paper. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his gaze moving over her calculations. "You're running numbers on my ranch," he said. "Our ranch," she said without looking up. "Or it will be once we're married, which I understand we haven't discussed formally." The pause that followed that sentence was significant. "I haven't exactly extended a formal invitation," he said carefully. "I know," she said. She set down the pencil and looked up at him. "That's all right. I haven't been waiting for one. I came here on the understanding that we would assess the situation and proceed accordingly. I'm assessing the situation." He came into the kitchen, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat. For a long moment he looked at the paper between them. "What do you see?" he asked. "I see a solvable problem," she said. His jaw tightened. She'd come to understand this was what he did when something moved him in a direction he hadn't anticipated. He fought it by tightening. "Chastain would disagree with that assessment," he said. "Chastain wants you to disagree with it too," she said. "That's the hidden motive in everything he's doing. He doesn't want the money. He wants the land. The money's just the mechanism." The words hit him. She could see it. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You worked that out fast," he said. "It's not complicated once you understand what he values," she said. "A banker who wants money extends terms. A man who wants land calls loans." He was quiet. Then, "What's your proposal?" She laid it out for him. It had 3 parts. The first was an immediate partial sale of the oldest cattle, those past optimal production age, to raise operating cash and demonstrate to Chastain that the ranch was active and not merely surviving on fumes. The second was a direct approach to the Cattlemen's Association in Fort Worth, which she knew from her father's reading had recently established a loan assistance program for exactly the kind of drought and disease recovery that Cedar Cross had experienced. The third was a proposal she kept to herself for the moment, one that required some more information about the Becker property, because she wasn't yet ready to put it forward without knowing whether it was viable. Elias listened. He asked 3 questions, each precise and practical. He did not argue. He did not immediately agree. What he did was look at her the way you look at something that's changing the shape of the room. "You knew about the loans before you came," he said finally. "I knew the ranch was struggling," she said. "I didn't know the specifics until Petey told me. And you still came." "I already told you that." "Why?" He asked it quietly, and it was different from all the other questions. It was personal in a way that made the lamp seem to lower. Maggie considered the honest answer. She thought about giving him a practical one instead. She decided that a man who'd been surrounded by secrets and hidden motives deserved the honest version, even if it was harder to say. "Because I spent 2 years watching other people decide what I could and couldn't handle," she said. "Deciding what I was worth and what I wasn't, and I was done with that. I read your advertisement and I thought, here is a man being honest about what he has and what he needs. I can work with honest." Something moved across his face that she couldn't name entirely, but it was connected to something deep and old, the kind of thing that has its roots in a person's earliest experiences of the world. "My advertisement didn't mention the loans," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it also didn't pretend things were fine. That mattered. The silence between them after that was different. It had changed texture. It was still careful, still held at a certain distance, but it was warmer than it had been. He helped her with the numbers after that. They worked side by side at the kitchen table for another hour, his handwriting alongside hers on the paper, and by the time they were done, the outline of a plan existed that was not just a plan but the beginning of a shared language. She lay awake for a long time after she went to bed, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind move across the roof, and told herself very firmly not to think about the complicated green-gray of his eyes. She thought about it anyway. The following Monday, Elias drove to Colby Creek to send a wire to the Cattlemen's Association in Fort Worth. Maggie stayed at the ranch, not because she couldn't have gone, but because she wanted to talk to Cord. She found him doing what he seemed to spend a great deal of time doing, which was work that kept him adjacent to busyness without requiring significant output. She handed him a list of things that needed organizing in the barn, an actual necessary task that she'd made deliberately extensive. And while he worked on it, she asked him, in a conversational and entirely unpointed way, about Colby Creek, about the people there, about what he'd done before he hired on at Cedar Cross. Cord answered all of it smoothly and too fully, which was itself a kind of answer. She discovered 2 things in that hour. The first was that Cord had worked at a property adjacent to one of Chastain's business interests before coming to Cedar Cross, which was not conclusive but was suggestive. The second was that he'd asked, casually, twice, about the state of the account at the bank. Not in a way that was overtly suspicious, but in a way that was designed to fish for information. And she was very good at recognizing bait. She resolved to give him something to report that was both believable and useless. When Elias returned from town, he found her in the barn talking with Petey about the horses. Cedar Cross had 3 working horses and needed at least 1 more, and he came in and stood there for a moment with an expression that she couldn't immediately read. "The wire went out," he said, "and there was a letter waiting at the post office." He held it out. She looked at it. It was addressed to him, not to her, which meant she had no right to open it, but he was holding it out in a way that meant he wanted her to read it. It was from Chastain's lawyer. 60 days had been reduced to 45. New information had come to Chastain's attention suggesting that Cedar Cross was insolvent rather than merely cash poor, and in light of that information the timeline had been adjusted. New information from someone who had been watching from inside. Maggie folded the letter carefully. She handed it back. "We have a problem with Cord," she said. "Tell me," Elias said. She told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, without minimizing. When she was done, his expression had settled into something that was controlled and cold and entirely purposeful. "I'll handle it," he said. "I want to be clear about how," she said. He looked at her. "Send him to Chastain with a message," she said. "Something that looks like a surrender but isn't. Use it." He was quiet for several seconds. "You want me to let him keep reporting," Elias said slowly. "I want us to control what he reports." The use of us was deliberate. She saw him register it. "You're not what I was expecting," he said quietly. "Nobody ever is," she said. The plan required them to create a believable fiction for Cord to carry back. That Elias had been unable to reach the Cattlemen's Association and was considering speaking to Chastain about an alternative arrangement, one that might involve surrendering the western pasture as partial payment. This was enough to make Chastain think his pressure was working, and enough to make him wait rather than accelerate further. It would buy time. While Cord was busy carrying this fiction to Chastain, the real response was taking shape. The wire to Fort Worth came back with an answer that was not a yes but was not a no. It was a request for documentation. The association wanted 3 years of production records, the mortgage terms, and a current assessment of the herd's market value. Elias had the records, though they required unearthing from a box his father had kept in the bottom of the wardrobe in his bedroom, which he had apparently not opened since Nathaniel died. He brought the box to the kitchen table one night after supper and set it down with a carefulness that betrayed how weighted the object was for him. "My father's records," he said. "I know," Maggie said. "Petey told me about the wardrobe." He sat down. He didn't open the box immediately. She could see him gathering something. "He was a difficult man," Elias said. "Strong and difficult in the particular way that men are difficult when they've survived something that they never properly dealt with. The war took things from him that he never talked about. But he built this," Maggie said. "He built this," Elias agreed. "And he loved this land the way he couldn't love people." That was his particular burden. "And yours?" she asked. He looked at her. The question sat between them with all its implications. "Mine is different," he said. "I can love people. I made a choice once that cost someone something, and I've had a hard time getting past the idea that I might do it again." It was more than he'd said about himself in any single moment since she'd arrived. She could see that he knew it too, and that he was slightly startled by his own disclosure. She didn't push. She opened the box and began sorting the records, and he sat beside her and helped, and that was enough for the moment. They worked until past midnight. The records were comprehensive. Nathaniel Finley had been meticulous in his documentation even when everything else was falling apart. By the time they'd assembled what the association needed, Maggie had a clear picture not just of Cedar Cross's troubles but of its potential, and it was a better potential than she'd initially calculated. "Your father expanded the water access in 1876, she said, looking at a survey note she'd found in the back of one of the ledgers. "He dug a second tank in the east pasture," Elias said. "Cost him most of a year's profit, but he said it would pay back." "It already has on paper," she said. "The cattle that survived the disease outbreak last year, a higher percentage of them were from the east pasture, better watered, better conditioned." She looked at him. "This is actually relevant for the association assessment. It shows the land management was sound even when the finances weren't." Something brightened in him. Not the automatic flash of excitement, but something slower and more real, the kind of recognition that comes when you've been living with a dark past so long that you've stopped seeing the light that was always also there. "I hadn't put those two things together," he said. "You were too close to it," she said. And you were grieving. The word landed between them quietly. He didn't flinch from it. Yes, he said. That's allowed, she said, grieving, even while everything else needs to be handled. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face in that moment was something she recognized because she'd felt it herself, the particular relief of being seen clearly by someone who was not going to use what they saw against you. You lost someone too, he said. My mother, she said, 3 years ago. My father had already been gone 2 years before that. I know what it's like to be the last person in a house. Is that why you answered the advertisement? He asked. Not pointed, just careful. Partly, she said honestly. The rest of it is what I told you the other night. They were very close together over the papers. She was aware of this in a way that had been building for days, a physical awareness that she'd been managing with the discipline of someone who decided that the work came first. She folded a receipt and put it in its proper pile and told herself firmly that there were several excellent reasons to maintain her current composure. She maintained it. Elias took the documentation to the postal station in Colby Creek the next morning and had Petey ride with him so that Cord couldn't report on the errand without appearing to have followed, which would expose him too clearly. In town, Elias also stopped to speak with the local justice of the peace, a man named Harold Greer who had served in that capacity for 15 years and who, crucially, was not allied with Chastain. He returned in the afternoon with 2 things: the receipt for the posted documentation and the information that Harold Greer would be available to perform a marriage ceremony at the ranch or in town, whenever and if ever both parties were ready. He told her this at supper with a precision that was careful and not entirely comfortable but was honest. I want to be clear, he said, that nothing requires you to do anything you haven't decided you want. You can stay and work and the arrangement can be whatever it needs to be. I won't hold you to anything just because you came. Maggie set down her fork. Elias, she said. He looked at her. I came here, she said, because I read what you wrote and I decided I wanted to come. I am staying because I've decided I want to stay, and I will make whatever decisions come next based on what I want, not on what I feel obligated to do. She picked her fork back up. So you can stop worrying about whether I'm here under obligation. I'm here because I want to be. He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad, he said simply, and that was the moment she began falling. She didn't acknowledge it to herself immediately, but something settled in her chest that evening that had not been settled before, something warm and specific that had Elias Finley's name all over it whether she was prepared to admit it or not. The response from the Cattlemen's Association came 12 days later. 12 days that were full of work. The cattle sale she'd planned had gone through. A straightforward transaction with a buyer from Amarillo who'd been doing business with Cedar Cross for years, and who drove down personally when Elias contacted him. The sale of 8 cattle at a better-than-expected price put enough cash in the Cedar Cross account to cover 1 mortgage payment and fund the additional supplies they needed. Cord remained on the payroll, carrying his edited intelligence back to Chastain and reporting faithfully that Cedar Cross was making slow and desperate moves. Chastain, according to the whisper network that Petey maintained with the thoroughness of a man who understood that information was currency, had relaxed slightly. He was confident. He was waiting. The association's response was a conditional approval, conditional on a site visit from one of their representatives, a man named Foster Davies, who would need to assess the herd and the land in person before the formal loan could be arranged. Foster Davies would arrive in 3 weeks. 3 weeks was achievable, but only barely, given the 45-day window from Chastain's letter. The night they received the approval, Maggie and Elias sat on the porch in the spring evening air, the sky enormous above them in the way that Texas sky was enormous, more stars than you could count and a darkness between them that felt enormous and breathable at once, and for the first time since she'd arrived, they were both sitting still at the same time with no task immediately before them. Tell me what you said to me when I arrived, he said. Exactly, she thought back. I said the ranch was a starting point. How did you know that? She thought about it. the honest answer. Because I'd been watching people call things finished for 2 years, she said. And I'd gotten very good at recognizing the difference between things that were actually done and things that just needed someone to decide they weren't. And you thought Cedar Cross was the second kind. I thought you were, she said. He turned to look at her. In the darkness, the complicated color of his eyes was lost, but the expression in them was not. That's a generous way to see someone you didn't know, he said. I read 3 months of your letters before I came, she said. They were honest letters. A person can tell a great deal about someone from letters that are actually honest. The correspondence between them had started in February, 6 weeks after he'd placed the advertisement in the Abilene paper. It had been careful at first, practical questions about logistics and preferences and skills. She had told him she could cook, sew, manage accounts, ride a horse with reasonable competence, and build a fire in adverse conditions. He had told her about the land, the cattle, the state of the house, the nature of the work. He had not mentioned, in the letters, the full extent of the financial situation, but he had mentioned that things were difficult, and he had done so without self-pity, which she'd found admirable. What she hadn't told him was that somewhere around the 5th letter she'd started reading his words twice. "What did you think of me?" he asked. "From the letters. I thought you were someone who'd been alone long enough that he'd forgotten how to ask for what he needed. The silence that followed that was long and not uncomfortable. You might be right about that," he said. "I know I am," she said. "But you're learning." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the first time she'd heard anything close to one, and it rearranged something in her entirely. "Maggie," he said. "Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that whatever your answer is, I will respect it." "Ask," she said. "Would you be willing to be married before Davies arrives? Not for appearances, but because He stopped. He started again. Because I would like you to be, if you're willing." The stars were very bright. The wind moved across the yard with a sound like whispering. "Yes," she said, "I would be willing." Harold Greer came to Cedar Cross on a Thursday, which was the 8th of May, 1882, and he married them in the front room of the house with Petey as witness, and a small bunch of wildflowers that Maggie had collected from the east pasture that morning in one hand. Cord had been sent to do work in the far north section of the property and did not attend. The ceremony was short and direct and completely legal. When Harold Greer told Elias he could kiss his bride, the pause that preceded the moment was long enough that Maggie almost laughed. Then Elias put his hand against her jaw carefully, like someone handling something he was afraid of breaking, and kissed her with a precision and a tenderness that told her everything she needed to know about what existed underneath all that control. She walked out of the ceremony a married woman and stood in the yard of a failing ranch that she had decided to call a starting point and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. There was not time for sentiment. Foster Davies arrived in 18 days. There was an enormous amount to do. The east pasture needed attention. The water tank her father-in-law had dug was operational, but the access path needed clearing, and she wanted Davies to see it properly. The remaining cattle needed to be in their best condition, which meant careful grazing management for the next several weeks. The house needed to be in order, not for show, but because she had come to discover that the state of the main house was a reasonable indicator of overall operations to someone with experience assessing ranches, and the main house at Cedar Cross had been existing in a state of bachelor neglect that she was systematically addressing. She also needed to resolve the situation with Cord. She discussed it with Elias on the evening after the wedding, sitting at the kitchen table which had become their regular place for the conversations that mattered. "If we let Cord go now, Chastain knows something changed," he said. "If Cord is here during Davies' visit, he'll report back on the association involvement," Maggie said, "and we don't know how Chastain will react to that information." "Badly," Elias said. "He'll react badly. We need to control the timing," she said. "We need Cord to leave before Davies arrives, but we need a reason for him to go that looks natural. They thought about this together for a while. "I'll give him a task that takes him to Amarillo," Elias said. "Something real but extended. 3 weeks minimum." "The Garfield buyer," Maggie said, following the thought. "You could send Cord with a message and a preliminary agreement on the next sale and have him stay to help coordinate the transport. That's legitimate enough that he can't object," Elias said. "And it gets him out of here before Davies comes. And by the time he gets back," Maggie said, "either we have the association loan and Chastain's position is significantly weaker, or we don't and it doesn't matter." Elias nodded. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and in its light he looked tired and determined and alive in a way that she'd been watching grow in him over the weeks. "You planned this kind of thing before?" he asked. "The chess game version of problem solving. I grew up with a father who played chess," she said. "He taught me that you never respond to a threat directly. You change the board." "Your father sounds like someone I'd have liked," he said. "He would have liked you," she said. "And then, because it was true, he would have trusted you." The word trust landed with a particular weight between two people who were still learning the shape of that thing in relation to each other. Cord left for Amarillo the following Monday, apparently unsuspecting, equipped with a letter of introduction to the Garfield buyer, and the not entirely wrong information that Cedar Cross was desperate to close the next sale quickly. He rode out in the morning, and Maggie watched him go from the porch and felt something loosen in the operations of the ranch that had been pulled tight since her first week. With Cord gone and Foster Davies 2 weeks out, the work intensified. Petey hired on 2 additional temporary hands, brothers named Sam and Wendell Cooper from the neighboring property, whose owner had offered their services as a professional courtesy that Petey had apparently cultivated over years. They were solid workers and did not talk over much, which was exactly what the situation required. Maggie drove the fence work and the pasture rotation while Elias focused on the cattle, the records preparation for Davies, and a set of correspondence he was conducting with a lawyer in Abilene whom he'd engaged, on Maggie's advice, to review the acceleration clause terms in Chastain's loans for any technical irregularity. This last had been her idea, sprung from a memory of her father once telling her that a contract was only as solid as the precision of its language, and that powerful men in a hurry were often careless with precision, because they assumed the weight of their power would carry the imprecision. The Abilene lawyer's name was Josiah Tremaine, and his response came at the end of the first week and was more significant than either of them had hoped. The acceleration clause in the second loan, the larger of the two, contained a drafting error, a minor one. A clause that referred to consecutive missed payments, but used language that technically required notice to be served to the borrower at least 10 days before each payment date for the consecutiveness to legally count, and Chastain had not served proper notice on the first of the 3 missed payments. Tremaine believed, with what he described as reasonable confidence, that this created grounds to challenge the validity of the acceleration. Elias sat with that letter for a long time. Maggie sat with him. "This doesn't fix everything," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It gives us leverage. It means we can fight instead of just survive." "Yes," he folded the letter. He looked out the window at the land that stretched flat and golden under the Texas sun, the land that had been his father's obsession and his own inheritance and his burden and his home. "I'm going to fight for this," he said. It was not bravado. It was something quieter and more permanent, a decision made at a level where decisions take. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you do it since I got here." He turned and looked at her. The moment stretched between them with all its accumulated weight, weeks of mornings on the fence line and evenings at the kitchen table and 1,000 shared decisions, the slowly built reality of a partnership that had started as a practical arrangement and had become something that neither of them was treating practically anymore. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he'd touched her since the wedding, and the wedding had been formal. This was not formal. This was a man touching a woman because he needed the connection and had decided to stop pretending he didn't. She turned her hand over and held his. "You're the best thing that's come to this ranch in a long time," he said. "The starting point," she said quietly. "Starting point," he agreed, and the words had a different sound now than they'd had that first day in the yard. They'd been an announcement then. They were a promise now. Foster Davies arrived on a Tuesday morning, a compact, efficient man of about 45 with a weathered face and a professional manner that missed nothing. He had a notebook, and he used it constantly. And within the first hour of his visit, Maggie had formed the distinct impression that he was significantly smarter than his manner suggested, and that any attempt to present Cedar Cross as anything other than what it was would be immediately apparent to him. She didn't attempt it. She brought him through the operation honestly, presenting the ledgers, the cattle numbers, the current pasture conditions, and the water access documentation, including the East Tank survey and the correlation she'd identified between that tank and the better disease survival rate among the East pasture cattle. She answered every question directly. She acknowledged where things had been difficult and where they remained difficult. She presented the plan forward with the same precision she'd used when she'd first laid it out for Elias at the kitchen table. Davies listened. He asked questions. He walked the east pasture himself and crouched to examine the soil near the water tank. He spent 40 minutes with the cattle and another 20 with the fence line. At the end of the day, he sat down at the kitchen table that had become the nerve center of everything, and opened his notebook. "The operation is understaffed and undercapitalized," he said. "That's the honest picture." "Yes," Elias said. "The land quality is good. The water access is better than most properties in this county, which is notable. The cattle that survive the disease year are healthy animals." Davies looked at his notebook. "Your wife's assessment of the East pasture correlation is accurate and was useful to my report." Maggie felt Elias glance at her briefly. "The association's program is designed for exactly this kind of situation," Davies continued. "Sound land and management overtaken by debt accumulated during adverse circumstances. Your application is strong." He closed the notebook. "I'll be filing a recommendation for approval when I get back to Fort Worth. You should receive formal confirmation within 2 weeks." The relief was enormous, but she contained it. Elias contained it too. They were a matched pair in that moment, two people who'd learned to hold the big feelings until there was space for them. Davies left the following morning after a breakfast that Maggie made more elaborate than was strictly necessary, because she decided that Davies had earned it. When his wagon disappeared up the road, Petey let out a whoop from the barn that startled 2 of the horses. Sam Cooper laughed. Wendell Cooper said something inaudible that made his brother laugh again. Elias turned to Maggie in the yard. "We still have Chastain," he said. "I know," she said. "Even with the association loan, we need that legal challenge to hold." "Tremont says it holds," she said, "and I believe him." He looked at her steadily. "You believe everyone until they give you a reason not to." "No," she corrected him. "I assess people carefully and then commit to the assessment. It's different." He almost smiled. She'd been cataloging his almost smiles since the wedding, adding them up. "What did you assess about me?" he asked. "From the letters." "From the letters and from this." He gestured, meaning everything, the yard and the house and the weeks between her arrival and this moment. She thought about how to be accurate. "I assessed that you were a man who'd been carrying more than his share for long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight," she said. "And that underneath the weight, there was someone who was capable of something real, someone who was honest enough that the realness could be trusted." The wind moved across the yard. The spring air smelled of grass and earth and something that was purely Texas, that particular combination of space and light that she'd initially found overwhelming and had come to find essential. "And," he said, "and I assessed that if someone stood beside him and didn't leave, he would eventually stop waiting for them to leave," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the things they'd been building toward. He crossed the yard to her in 2 steps, and he kissed her in the broad daylight, in the middle of the yard, with Petey pretending not to look from the barn and the Cooper brothers having developed a sudden intense interest in the fence line. and it was nothing like the careful, precise kiss on their wedding day. It was the kiss of a man who'd stopped holding the door closed. She kissed him back with equal conviction. Tremin's legal challenge was filed with the district court in the first week of June. Chastain's lawyer responded with what Tremin described in a letter as the predictable bluster of a man who knows the ground is shifting under him. The court set a hearing date for early July. Cord returned from Amarillo sometime in the second week of June. He found a ranch that looked significantly more operational than the one he'd left, an additional hand he didn't recognize, a water tank that had been improved, and cattle that were in visible good condition. He also found a couple. Whatever he'd expected to come back to, this wasn't it. Elias let him go the day after he returned. He did it in a way that was direct and without accusation, because he had no interest in a confrontation that could be avoided. He told Cord that the operation was changing direction and the current hand count would need to be restructured, and he paid him fair wages for his full time, including the Amarillo trip, and told him he was free to go. Cord went. Whether he reported back to Chastain and what that report contained was irrelevant at that point. The association loan had been formally approved. The documentation arrived by post 2 days after Cord's departure, and Maggie read it 3 times the way she'd read Dorothea Crane's warning letter before boarding the train. But this time with entirely different results in her chest. The loan was enough to retire the first of the 2 Chastain loans entirely and make substantial progress on the second. Combined with the legal challenge to the acceleration clause in the second loan, Chastain's position had shifted from predatory certainty to precarious overreach. He came to the ranch himself on a Thursday afternoon in late June, and it was the first time Maggie had seen him in person. Vernon Chastain was a tall man in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome, and now bore the marks of too many years of being agreed with. He arrived in a good buggy with a driver, which was itself a statement about what he thought of the territory between his bank and Cedar Cross. He was not hostile when he arrived. He was smooth, which was worse. He spoke to Elias first, which was a choice that Maggie acknowledged without indicating that she'd noticed. He expressed concern. He expressed sympathy for the difficulty of operating in adverse conditions. He spoke in the polished language of a man who regularly delivered bad news in pleasant packaging and was accustomed to the packaging being sufficient. "I think there are terms we can still arrive at," he said, standing in the yard of Cedar Cross in his good coat. "That might be mutually beneficial. We've engaged the Cattlemen's Association," Elias said, "and we've filed with the district court on the notice irregularity in the second loan." Chastain's expression did not change immediately. The change came a half-second later and it was contained, but Maggie saw it. She was watching for it. "The association," Chastain said. "I see." "The hearing is in July," Elias said. "We're prepared to proceed." Chastain looked at Maggie for the first time, a slow and assessing look, the look of a man reassigning his understanding of a situation. "Mrs. Finley," he said, "I understand you're recently arrived." 12 weeks ago," she said. Quite the adjustment, the Texas frontier. His tone was pleasant, the subtext was not. "I've found it suits me," she said. He looked between them. He was recalculating. She could see the arithmetic happening behind his eyes. "I'll have my lawyer review the notice matter," he said finally, "and we'll be in touch." "We'll be at the hearing," Elias said. Chastain left with his driver and his good buggy, and he did not come back. The July hearing went in Elias' favor on the notice irregularity. Tremin had been right about the drafting error, and the district judge, a rigorous man named Calloway who had no discernible affection for Chastain's particular brand of commerce, ruled that the acceleration on the second loan was invalid as executed. Chastain could pursue standard default remedies on the remaining balance, but those remedies required proper notice and proper timeline, which gave Elias and Maggie, with the association loan in place, exactly enough room to operate. They weren't free. But they weren't trapped. They drove home from the hearing in the buggy that had replaced the wagon as Cedar Cross's primary transportation. a purchase that had been one of Maggie's first contributions to the operation from her own modest savings. And Elias held the reins, and she sat beside him, and the Texas summer pressed its heat down on everything equally, and she felt the kind of tiredness that comes after a long effort completed rather than the kind that comes from ongoing weight. "We should celebrate," he said. "What did you have in mind?" "I've been told there's a dance in town Saturday, at the Grange Hall." She looked at him. "You're suggesting we go dancing?" "I'm suggesting we go to a thing that functions as a dance and conduct ourselves in whatever manner suits us." The almost smile was there, more pronounced now than it used to be. She'd been watching it develop over the months, a smile that started at the corner of his eyes first. "Petey told me you mentioned to him that you used to dance." "Petey mentioned that," she said. "He mentioned it to me with what I can only describe as deliberate significance." She laughed. Actually laughed, full and without restraint, and he turned to look at her with an expression on his face that was so unguarded that she had to look away for a moment to let him collect himself. They went to the dance. They danced twice, which was all the floor allowed in the crowded Grange Hall, and both times she was aware of him the way she'd been aware of things she was trying not to want for the first 2 months at Cedar Cross. Aware of the width of his shoulders and the careful way he moved, and the particular quality of his attention, which was absolute and without distraction, the kind of attention that was its own form of devotion even when it looked like it was just dancing. On the drive home, the stars were doing their enormous Texas thing above them, and she let herself lean slightly against his shoulder, which she'd been refraining from doing for months in the interest of her own equilibrium. He adjusted his grip on the reins and put his arm around her. They drove the rest of the way to Cedar Cross like that, in the warm dark under too many stars, and she thought about Dorothea Crane's warning letter, and the train she'd boarded anyway and the yard she'd stood in on a Wednesday afternoon in April, and said the words that had turned out to be more accurate than she'd even intended them to be when she said them. A starting point. Summer moved into autumn. The work at Cedar Cross had the quality of things moving in the right direction, rather than merely fighting to stay in place, and that difference changed the texture of every day. With the association loan, Elias was able to hire 2 full-time hands, a man named George Abrams who'd worked cattle in West Texas for 15 years, and a younger man named Daniel Reyes, whose family had been in the region for 2 generations, and who knew the land with the particular intimacy that comes from lifelong relationship with a place. The south fence was fully repaired. The cattle herd was building again, slowly and carefully, with 2 new breeding bulls acquired through a purchase Maggie had helped negotiate. The house had been improved incrementally, a new roof section over the kitchen, a proper pantry built with timber from the salvaged bunkhouse that no longer needed to house anyone, 2 windows reglazed with new glass that actually kept out the wind. Maggie had turned the second bedroom into a workroom, where she kept the accounts and the planning and the ongoing correspondence with Tremaine and with the association. She also kept, on the shelf above the desk, the letter from Dorothea Crane, folded and flat, not as a reproach but as a reminder of the distance between what a thing looked like from outside and what it actually was when you got close enough to see it properly. She was at the workroom desk on an October morning when the particular nausea she'd been managing quietly for 2 weeks made itself impossible to ignore. She sat still for a moment. She thought about timing. She thought about what she knew about her own body and what it was telling her. She went to find Elias. He was at the east tank, doing a maintenance check on the feed line that ran down from the storage barrel. He looked up when he heard her approach, and something in her face told him something was changed before she'd said a word, because he straightened completely and came toward her with his full attention. "I think we're going to need to expand the bedroom," she said. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds. "Maggie," he said. "In about 7 months, I'd estimate," she said. "Give or take." The expression that crossed his face was the most undefended thing she had ever seen on a human being. It went through joy and terror and wonder and landed somewhere that didn't have a clean name, something that encompassed all of them and was larger than any of them individually. He crossed to her in 2 strides and held her with a care and a completeness that was everything she'd been watching build in him since that first day in the yard. "You're sure?" he said, his voice different than usual. "I'm reasonably sure," she said. "I'll see Dr. Haskins in town next week to confirm." He held her for a moment longer, then he leaned back and looked at her face. "How are you feeling?" "Nauseous in the mornings," she said. "Otherwise fine. You didn't say anything. I wanted to be reasonably sure before I said anything." He shook his head slightly, which she had come to understand was what he did when she did something that was both entirely predictable and entirely impressive. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it directly because she was someone who asked things directly. "Maggie," he said, "I have spent the last 20 years of my life building something in this land that I was afraid I'd never get to pass on. I lost my mother when I was 17. I watched my father put everything he had into something he couldn't share properly. And then I put an advertisement in a paper because I didn't know how else to reach for the thing I wanted. And a woman showed up from Abilene with 2 trunks and a hat box and called a failing ranch a starting point." He put his hands against her face. "Am I happy?" It wasn't a question. The intonation made it a statement of everything that question implied. She pressed her hands over his. Dr. Haskins confirmed the following week that Maggie Finley was expecting a child in late April or early May of 1883. He was a practical man who delivered his medical information in the same plain style that she appreciated in everyone, and he told her what to expect and what to watch for, and what was normal and what wasn't, and she listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything. The expansion of the bedroom was begun in November, framed and cited by Elias and George Abrams and Daniel Reyes over 2 hard-working weekends, a proper addition to the west side of the house that gave them space for a cradle and eventual other furnishings. Petey, who had been at Cedar Cross long enough to have clear emotional investment in its continuation, took the news with the dignified restraint of a man who did not cry in front of other people and was clearly engaged in the active management of that goal. "Your father would have been pleased," he told Elias one evening, and it was perhaps the most emotional thing Petey had said in the years Elias had known him. "I know," Elias said. The winter was cold but navigable. The house held its warmth, the pantry was stocked, and the Cedar Cross operation moved through January and February with the steadiness of something that had learned its own ground. Chastain made no further moves. The district court ruling had taken sufficient wind from his position that attempting further pressure on the Finley ranch had become more costly than it was worth. He was a man who understood cost and benefit above all things, and the benefit of Cedar Cross had diminished significantly since Maggie's arrival changed the board. There were difficult things too, because life in the Texas frontier did not exempt itself from difficulty regardless of the direction the primary story was moving. In February, one of the new breeding bulls showed signs of illness, and for 2 weeks the careful progress of the herd's rebuilding was held in precarious suspension while they managed his condition, calling on Dr. Haskins's colleague, a veterinarian who came from Colby Creek, and doing the watching and the doctoring and the hoping that animal husbandry required. The bull recovered, which was a relief out of proportion to the event itself, which told Maggie something about how much she'd come to care about this land and everything on it. In March, Maggie received a letter from Dorothea Crane. She hadn't written to Dorothea since arriving in Texas, which she knew was something she should remedy, and she opened the letter with a small collection of feeling. Dorothea wrote that she'd heard through the Colby Creek social network that things at Cedar Cross were going considerably better than her warning letter had predicted. She wrote that she was glad. She wrote, with the particular dignity of a woman who was secure enough to acknowledge when she'd been wrong in her assumptions, that she hoped Maggie had not been offended by the letter, which had been sent from concern rather than condescension. Maggie wrote back that she had not been offended, that the letter had in fact confirmed for her that she was making the right choice, and that she hoped to receive Dorothea for a visit at Cedar Cross sometime in the spring, when the weather permitted. She also wrote at the end that she and Elias were expecting their first child in May, and that the ranch was coming along well, and that she was glad she'd boarded the train. The baby came on the 2nd of May, 1883, in the bedroom of the house at Cedar Cross, attended by Dr. Haskins and a woman named Mrs. Caldwell from town who served as midwife, and by Elias, who had refused to be moved from the vicinity in a way that Maggie found both extremely touching and practically reassuring. The labor was long and the morning was well advanced before it was done, and what came of it was a boy. A healthy, loud, furious boy with Elias' dark hair and a set of lungs that suggested he had objections to register about the transition he'd just been required to make. Elias held his son with the expression of someone in the presence of something entirely outside their previous experience. His hands, which could handle fence wire and cattle and tools with absolute competence, were careful in a completely different way with this small being. "What do we call him?" Maggie asked. She was exhausted in a fundamental way and also wide awake in a fundamental way, which was apparently what childbirth did to a person. "Nathaniel," Elias said, without hesitation. Then he looked at her to confirm she was all right with that choice. "After your father," she said, "if that's agreeable to you." "It's more than agreeable," she said. "Nathaniel built this place. Nathaniel should have a part in what comes next." He looked at her with the unguarded expression she'd been collecting since October and said, "Nathaniel James Finley, then, James for your father." She hadn't told him her father's middle name was James. She'd only mentioned her father's first name, which was William. She started to say so and then stopped. "How did you know my father's middle name?" she asked. "Your cousin mentioned it in a letter to Petey," he said. "They've been corresponding for about 4 months. Petey has been keeping me informed of what I should know." She stared at him. Then she laughed, which surprised the baby, who complained loudly about the noise. "Petey," she said. "He is a profoundly invested individual," Elias agreed. They named the boy Nathaniel James, and they brought him home to Cedar Cross in a house that had been made ready by Petey and the hands. The cradle set up in the new bedroom addition, the wood box full, the kitchen stocked by a delivery that George Abrams had organized with a thoroughness that would have been touching under any circumstances, and was, under these, almost overwhelming. Dorothea Crane visited in June, driving down from Colby Creek with her sister, and she sat in the front room of the house that was no longer neglected and held baby Nathaniel, and told Maggie that she was glad she hadn't listened to the letter. "I'm glad too," Maggie said, "though I did read it." "You read it and came anyway." "You gave me good information," Maggie said. "What I did with it was my own choice." Dorothea shook her head slowly, in the manner of someone who had been presented with a personality that continues to surprise even in familiar territory. "You are a particular kind of woman, Maggie Finley," she said. "I've been told," Maggie said. Summer came back around, the second summer at Cedar Cross, and it was different from the first in the way that everything was different when the foundation had changed. The herd had grown. The hands were settled and competent. The accounts, while not yet flush, were solvent in the real sense, not just technically but actually, the kind of solvency that had room in it and wasn't counting every dollar against 3 things at once. Elias had changed too. Not in the sense of having become someone different, but in the sense of having become more fully himself, as if the months and the work and the specific gravity of Maggie's presence had gradually stripped away the weight he'd been carrying and left the original person. He laughed more, he talked more. He was, she'd observed, working very hard to be the kind of father who did not inflict his own silences on his child, and the effort was visible and admirable and occasionally hilarious when Nathaniel, at 3 months old, was supremely uninterested in the information his father was earnestly attempting to convey about the East Pasture water system. "He will care about this eventually," Elias told her one evening, holding the baby, who was doing his best to eat his own fist. "He will," she agreed. "Give him a few years. I'm establishing the foundation. Elias," she said, "he's 3 months old. Starting points," he said, without any indication that he found this unreasonable. She pressed her face against his shoulder to contain her laughter so she wouldn't startle the baby again. The Becker property, the empty land north of Hendricks that she'd asked Petey about in her very first week, became relevant again in the late summer of 1883, and it became relevant in a way that Maggie had been quietly considering since the early months. The estate that held the Becker property had finally resolved its legal situation, and the land was available for purchase. It was 320 acres of reasonably good land with an existing well, and the remnants of a small structure that had been the original homestead. It shared a border with Cedar Cross's northern pasture. Acquiring it would expand Cedar Cross's grazing capacity by more than a third. It would also close off the northern approach that was currently the one direction from which the ranch's land position could be threatened by a neighbor with expansive ideas, and Hendricks, to the south, was a man Maggie had been watching with the watchfulness she brought to everyone who made her instincts work a little harder. The Becker land was not cheap. But with the association loan in place and the operation stable, it was not impossible, and the timing of the availability felt like the kind of thing you responded to when it came. She brought it to Elias on a Sunday afternoon, laid it out the way she laid everything out, numbers and reasoning and the realistic assessment of risk alongside the potential, and he listened the way he always listened, which was completely. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since my first week," she said. He looked at her. "Since your first week. I asked Petey about it when we were doing the south fence." "What else did you ask Petey about in your first week?" "Several things," she said. He was a good source of information. He shook his head in the way she loved. "You came here to save this ranch." "I came here because I wanted to," she corrected him. "The saving was incidental." "It wasn't incidental," he said. "Don't minimize it." She was quiet for a moment. He did this occasionally, pushed back gently when she deflected something that deserved to be received properly, and she'd come to understand that it was one of the ways he showed her that she was seen. "All right," she said. "I came here and I helped save this ranch, and now I want to help it grow." "The Becker land," he said. "The Becker land," she agreed. He looked at the numbers she'd laid out. He looked out the window at the land he loved in the particular way he'd always loved it. He looked at her. "Let's make an offer," he said. The purchase of the Becker property was completed in October of 1883, 18 months after Maggie Hawthorne had stepped off the train at Colby Creek Station with 2 leather trunks and a hat box, and a set of jaw muscles ready for everything that came next. It required a careful negotiation with the estate's representative, which Maggie conducted largely through correspondence and one meeting in town, and it required a precise calibration of what Cedar Cross could spend without compromising the stability it had built. Elias reviewed every figure. He had become comfortable, over the months, with this shared process of decision-making, not just accepting it but actively contributing to it in a partnership that used both of their minds rather than just one. The morning they signed the papers, they drove back to Cedar Cross in the buggy in the autumn air, and Elias stopped the horse at the crest of the slight rise in the road where you could see the full spread of the ranch's eastern boundary, which was now connected by the newly acquired northern edge to something larger than it had been. He sat still for a moment, looking at it. "When I was young," he said, "my father brought me to this spot once and told me to look at what he'd built." He was proud of it. He was also, I think he was afraid of it, of how much it meant to him, of what it would mean if he lost it. "That kind of love is frightening," Maggie said. "Yes," he turned to look at her. "I understand it now, the fear and the love and the way they're tangled up." She looked back at him. "But you're not your father," she said. "You don't have to carry it alone." "I know," he said. "You made that abundantly clear from about week 2. The corner of the eye's smile was fully present. "You made it clear by being completely impossible to push away." "I was raised by stubborn people," she said. Clearly, he held out his hand. She put hers in it. He held it the way he'd been holding it since that night over the records at the kitchen table, the night he decided to stop pretending he didn't need the connection. "I love you, Maggie." He said it directly, with no ornamentation, in the plain style that he used for everything true. She looked at him in the October light, at the man who'd been standing on a fence rail when she'd arrived and had spent the subsequent months stepping down from it, brick by brick, and becoming someone who stood on solid ground. "I love you," she said. "I have for a while." "How long?" "I think I was in trouble by the time we finished sorting your father's records," she said. "But I was calling it something else to give myself time to be sure." "What were you calling it?" "Practical concern for a business partner," she said. He laughed. Fully, completely, the real laugh that she'd been hearing more and more, the one that changed his whole face. The horse shifted in its traces, impatient with the delay, and they drove down the road and home to Cedar Cross, which was no longer a starting point but had become something built and real and theirs. Nathaniel at 8 months was a person with strong opinions about food, and a genuine delight in horses that Petey found deeply validating. He had Elias' habit of intense focus and Maggie's habit of not being dissuaded from a chosen course of action, which was already visible in the way he pursued any object placed within his reach, and the way he responded to being redirected, which was by finding a different route to the original objective. "He is going to be work," Elias observed one evening, watching his son pursue a wooden spool under the kitchen table with single-minded determination. "He's exactly like you," Maggie said. "He is extremely focused. He is extremely you," she said, "in the best possible way." Elias retrieved his son from under the table, which Nathaniel protested, and then found the spool and handed it over, which resolved the protest. "We're doing all right," Elias said. It was not a question, but it had the quality of something still being confirmed, the way a person says something they know to be true but find worth saying because the act of saying it is part of the knowing. "We're doing very well," Maggie said. "Better than all right." She was at the workroom desk that evening when she took out Dorothea Crane's letter and looked at it one more time, the old letter that had arrived as a warning and had become, in retrospect, a kind of map. "Here is the difficult terrain. Here is what you will encounter. Here is every reason to stay back." She folded it again and put it away, not in the traveling coat pocket where she'd carried it on the train, but in the small wooden box where she kept things that mattered: her parents' wedding photograph, her father's pocket watch, the first advertisement she'd ever seen for Cedar Cross Ranch, seeking a practical woman for partnership and potential matrimony. Practical woman. She'd been called that. She didn't mind it. Practical was what had gotten her on the train. Practical was what had held the fence posts and sorted the ledgers and sent Cord to Amarillo with a story. But practical was not the only thing she was, and she suspected it was not the thing Elias meant when he said her name the way he said it, with that particular quality of attention that was its own language. Spring came again in 1884. The second spring at Cedar Cross was the spring of a ranch that had found its footing. The herd was 60 strong and growing. The Becker Land's new grazing section was being brought into rotation. The house had been expanded again to properly account for what they were building, and Petey had developed a practice of lecturing small Nathaniel about the history of the property, with the seriousness of a man conveying essential wisdom to a willing student. Despite the student being 14 months old and primarily interested in the buttons on Petey's vest, Daniel Reyes had brought his younger brother on as an additional hand in January, and the Cedar Cross operation now had the feel of a small community rather than a lone holding, something with interconnected people and shared investment that Maggie had imagined during her first weeks and had now watched become real. Maggie knew she was expecting again in March, which she told Elias on an evening when the spring wind was moving across the land, and the lamplights were on in the house, and Nathaniel had gone to sleep with the comprehensive thoroughness that small children employ when the day's exertions have finally caught up with them. Elias received this news with a warmth that was different from the first time, still moved, still real, but without the terror that had been part of it the first time, because he knew this now, knew what it meant and what it asked of him, and he was not afraid of it. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better this time, actually," she said. "Less nauseous. I'm hoping it holds." "Whatever you need," he said. "Whatever changes need to happen for you to feel all right, we change them." She looked at him across the kitchen table that had been witness to more important conversations than any piece of furniture had a right to expect. "We're going to need to build on again," she said. "I was already thinking about it," he said. "The north side. George has ideas about the framing," she laughed. "You talked to George?" "I've been considering it since February," he said. She shook her head at him with the fullness of a woman who is entirely unsurprised by the man she married. The second child, a girl this time, came in October of 1884 in the same bedroom with the same Dr. Haskins and the same Mrs. Caldwell, and she was named Clara Josephine Finley. Clara for Elias' mother, whom she'd never known but whose absence had shaped so much of what Cedar Cross was. And Josephine for the particular combination of sounds that Maggie had always loved and had never had occasion to use before. Clara Josephine arrived in the world with a great deal more equanimity than her brother, regarding proceedings from the outset with a calm that Dr. Haskins described as unusual in a newborn, and Maggie found immediately recognizable. "She's assessing," Maggie told Elias. "She's 2 hours old," he said. "She's definitely assessing," Maggie said. Nathaniel's reaction to his sister was one of cautious investigation, followed by the decision that she was interesting, which Elias recorded in the small journal he'd started keeping at Maggie's suggestion, because she'd told him that the things that happened at Cedar Cross deserved to be written down, that their children and their children's children might want to know how the place had come to be what it was. He'd been writing in it every week. It was a plain record in his plain style, practical and honest, and occasionally, when he forgot, he was writing formally, full of something warmer than practicality. She'd read it once with his permission, and had found a sentence in the entry from the week of her arrival that had stayed with her ever since. The entry read, "She said it was a starting point, and I didn't have anything to say to that, because I believed her and I couldn't explain why I believed someone I just met." She'd folded that page carefully back in and returned the journal without comment, but she'd held the words. By the autumn of 1885, Cedar Cross carried a herd of 92 cattle, employed 5 full-time hands, and had been debt-free on all mortgage obligations for 3 months, a circumstance achieved through the combination of the association loan payoff, a particularly strong beef market year, and a disciplined management of the accounts that had been maintained without exception by the partnership at the center of the operation. Chastain had sold his bank interest and moved his primary operations to a different county, which the Colby Creek population received with the restrained but genuine satisfaction that a community feels when a particular kind of pressure has finally lifted. Petey, who would turn 60 in the spring, had made it known that he intended to retire within a few years, not because Cedar Cross needed him less, but because he had a sister in New Mexico whose health was not good, and who he wished to be closer to. He had said this with the careful practicality of a man who does not wish to make his own needs into a burden, and both Maggie and Elias had received the information with the firmness of people who intended to make sure his transition, when it came, was handled with the care it deserved. Maggie was at the desk in the workroom on a November morning in 1885, working on the end-of-year accounts, when Elias knocked on the door frame and leaned against it. She looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She gave him the measuring look she gave things that required assessment. "You have a face," she said. "I have one face," he said. "It's the only one I own. You know what I mean." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from the desk. She set down her pencil. Nathaniel, who was 2.5, was with Petey this morning, engaged in whatever educational program Petey had devised for the day. Clara was sleeping. The house was quiet in a way that felt like an invitation. "I was thinking," he said, "about what this place looked like when you arrived." 3 years ago April, she said. 3 years ago April, he agreed. "I was standing on a fence rail that wasn't up to the task, watching you arrive in a wagon, thinking I don't even know what I was thinking. Something along the lines of, she's real, she actually came." "I told you I'd come," she said. "You told me in letters," he said. "Letters can be changed. Letters can be taken back." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I didn't fully believe until you climbed down from that wagon without waiting for help." She smiled at the memory. "I didn't want to wait." "I know," he said. "That was when I thought either this is going to be completely impossible or it's going to be everything." "And," she said, "and it's everything," he said simply. "It's Maggie, it's more than I knew how to want before you showed up and showed me what wanting looked like when you weren't afraid of it." She set her hands flat on the desk. She looked at him, this man who had been lean and defensive and walled against the world the day she'd arrived, and who was still precise, still careful, still someone who held his words until he was sure of them, but who had none of the walls anymore. Or rather, the walls were still there, but they had doors in them now, and the doors opened for her completely. "I had a letter in my pocket on the train," she said. He listened. "A woman named Dorothea Crane wrote it to warn me off," she said. "She told me about the loans, the missing hands, the state of the operation. She meant to protect me from making a mistake." "You told me about Dorothea," he said. "I didn't tell you everything," she said. "The letter said," she wrote at the end, "that she didn't know you personally, but that the general consensus in Colby Creek was that you were a man who'd been alone long enough that he might not know how to let anyone in." He was quiet. "And I read that," she said, "and I thought that's not a warning, that's a description of someone who's been waiting without knowing how to ask." She held his gaze. "People who have been alone that long, when they finally let someone in, they let them all the way in. There's no half measure in them, it's everything or nothing." He said nothing for a moment. "You gambled on that," he said. "I assessed it," she corrected him. "And I was right." He reached across the desk and found her hand, and she gave it to him the way she'd given it every time since the first time, without reservation. "You were right," he said. Outside, the November wind moved across Cedar Cross in its long sweep from the north, the kind of wind that had an opinion about everything, and the house held against it, the way a house does when it's been built well and maintained carefully and lived in with intention. Nathaniel would come back from Petey at noon demanding food with the specific urgency of a 2-year-old. Clara would wake from her nap and be indignant about it, as she was about most things, before being talked out of her indignation by whoever got there first. George Abrams and Daniel Ray's and Daniel's brother would be working the north section of the Becker land, the section they were rotating the younger cattle through this season. Petey would come in for coffee at 11 with the certainty of a natural law. Cedar Cross would run. Not perfectly, because nothing ran perfectly, but solidly, the way things run when they've been given the chance to become what they were built to be. Maggie looked at the accounts in front of her, the columns she'd been keeping for 3 years, the record of a ranch that had been described to her as failing, that she had arrived at and called a starting point, and which had become through work and stubbornness and the particular alchemy of two people building something together, something real. She picked up her pencil. She made a note in the margin of the accounts page that had nothing to do with the accounts. She wrote, "Year 3 accounts in order. Cedar Cross solvent. November 1885. This is not where it started, this is where it is." She underlined it. Elias was still watching her. "What did you just write?" he asked. "A note," she said. "About the accounts." "Not exactly," she said. He knew better than to ask further. She would tell him when she was ready, or she would fold the paper and put it in the box with the other things that mattered, and either way she'd have her reasons. This was the ongoing negotiation of knowing someone completely, the space between what was shared immediately and what was kept private until it found its proper moment. She understood his silences. He understood her margins. They had built this understanding the same way they'd built everything else at Cedar Cross, deliberately, without pretending it was easy, without stopping when it was hard. Nathaniel would grow up on this land that his grandfather had built, and his father had nearly lost, and his mother had arrived too and called a starting point. Clara would grow up knowing the east pasture and the water tank and the sound of the wind in the particular way it moved across the cedar cross fence lines. There would be more after them, perhaps, more seasons and more children and more of the work that was also love, the daily necessary work of a life that had been chosen and was being chosen again every morning. Maggie closed the accounts and stood up. "Come outside," she said. Elias looked up. "It's November," he said. "I know what month it is," she said. He stood up. He got his coat. He got hers. He helped her into it in the way he'd been helping her into her coat since the autumn, because she was expecting again, a fact they'd confirmed with Dr. Haskins the week before, a fact they were not yet ready to share beyond the two of them, holding it in the particular warmth of something known only to the people it belongs to. They went out onto the porch of Cedar Cross, where the November wind hit them with its opinions, and stood together looking at the land that went out in every direction under a sky that was exactly as enormous as it had always been. She put her hand through his arm. He covered her hand with his. The land stretched away, the Becker acres to the north now part of what they were standing on, the south fence solid, the east pasture with its tank that had been dug in 1876 and had paid back its cost many times over, the herd somewhere in the middle distance doing what cattle did in November, moving and grazing and being the solid living substance of the operation. "I called it a starting point," she said. "You did," he said. "I was more right than I knew," she said. He turned his head and looked at her profile, at the woman who had come to a failing ranch in April of 1882 with 2 trunks and a hat box and a will that had proven to be in the same category as the land itself, vast and steady and not particularly interested in being told what it was capable of. "I love you," he said, in the plain way he said true things. "I love you," she said in the same way. The wind moved across Cedar Cross. The sky was enormous. The land went on. It was a starting point, and it had become a life, and the life was theirs, and it was good.